Okay. So it is 7 o'clock, so I guess we will get the ball rolling and get things started. Good evening, everyone. Bullying, once thought to be a childhood rite of passage, is now considered a serious social issue. Being the victim of or even being a witness to bullying can have detrimental effects on a child's mental health, emotional, and physical well-being. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, in the 2021-2022 school year, 19% of students aged 12 to 18 reported being bullied during school. The percentage of students who reported being bullied during school was higher for females, higher for students of two or more races, and higher for students in grades 6th, 7th, and 8th. With advances in technology and unfettered access many children have to social media, bullying can easily extend beyond the school day and into the children's homes. As the research on bullying has evolved, we have learned more and more about the long-term effects of bullying, which include susceptibility to anxiety or depression, low sense of self-worth, negative view of self and the world, development of eating disorders, substance abuse, trauma, and/or presence of suicidal ideation. The SAFE Coalition, Children, Families, and Community, is a unique partnership between Scarsdale Edgemont Family Counseling Services, the Scarsdale Library, the Scarsdale School District, Scarsdale Village Government, Scarsdale Police Department, the Westchester County Office for Women, as well as parents and concerned residents. Scarsdale Safe aims to raise awareness and prevent all forms of family, school, and community-based violence while emphasizing the importance of healthy relationship development. My name is Millie Chatelaine, and I am the Safe Coalition Coordinator. This evening's presentation is made possible thanks to funding provided by Assemblywoman Amy Powlin and Senator Shelley Mayer. Joining me tonight is James Genova, Executive Director of SFCS, and Olivia Barbazat, who is the youth outreach worker and a high school liaison for the Safe Coalition. We would also like to welcome the members of the Junior League of Central Westchester who are watching this evening's presentation from Wayside Cottage. Tonight, we are privileged to have two special guests lead the program, Emily Bazelon and Val Abrahams. Emily is the author of the novel we have gathered here to discuss, Sticks and Stones, Defeating the Culture of Bullying and Rediscovering the Power of Character and Empathy. Blending keen journalistic and narrative skills, Emily explores different facets of bullying through the stories of three young people who found themselves caught in the thick of it and chronicles how these kids' predicaments escalated into community-wide wars. Along the way, Emily defines what bullying is and, just as important, what it is not. She explores when intervention is essential and when kids should be given the freedom to fend for themselves. Joining Emily this evening is Val Abrahams, award-winning editor and reporter. Many of us know Val as the former editor of the Scarsdale Inquirer. Val is now currently an associate editor for Westchester Magazine. As both a Scarsdale parent and a journalist, we thought Val was the right person to lead this important conversation. This evening's program will be recorded and will be made available to the community. We expect Emily and Val to be in conversation for 40 minutes, and we will leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. Please use the Q&A function to ask your questions during the presentation. I will present as many of your questions as possible to Emily and Val at the end. So without further ado, I present you Emily Bazelon and Val Abrahams.
Thank you, Millie. And Emily, it's so nice to meet you here online. Your book is eminently readable, really researched thoroughly, and so even-handed. Yeah, you really approach this complicated issue, I think, in a very multi-layered fashion. My first question for you is, what inspired you to write Sticks and Stones, and what message do you hope to convey through this book?
Thanks so much, Val. It's great to meet you too. And I just want to say thank you also to Jay and to Millie for having me and introducing me. It's writing a book and then having people read it is incredibly gratifying. It's why we do the work, and I'm really glad to be here. I was inspired to write this book, I think most fundamentally because I take the problems and challenges of childhood and adolescence very seriously. I think sometimes, barring like the most dramatic forms of trauma, we kind of trivialize and forget about the adversity that kids and teenagers experience. And I was struck that this was an issue that truly all kinds of kids go through in different ways, and that really affects how people develop and how they think about themselves. I had an experience of bullying myself when I was in middle school, and I think that was part of what I was thinking about. But when I started working on the material in this book, it was also a moment where social media was really taking off, and kids' involvement in social media and the way that that was affecting their relationships with each other and providing more opportunities for bullying. That was all something we were just starting to explore. And so, as a journalist, when you have a personal connection to a topic and then you also see it becoming more relevant, kind of bubbling up, that's a good place to start.
Right. And speaking about social media, I guess we could ask you, how can parents, teachers, or other members of the community, leaders in the community, help children rely less on online interactions and make more real life connections?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had a magic wand to wave. Let's just back up a second and think through some of the problems that arise with a lot of online interactions. And this may be familiar to some of you because it's gotten much more attention since I wrote my book. There's a new Jonathan Haidt book out this year called The Anxiety Generation, The Anxious Generation, that has given this a lot of play, and lots of research on it as well. But, one thing that just strikes me over and over again is that when you lose the kind of face-to-face immediacy of an interaction, it becomes much easier to be mean, to misunderstand, to use the distance to distance oneself emotionally from the impact that that someone else is experiencing. And there also can be on some sites an opportunity for anonymity that like just exacerbates all the things I was just talking about. And I think we all know this. We've all seen, email threads or listserv or comment threads on a public site kind of spin out of control. And kids experience these things, they take them to heart. They can be more prone to them than adults because obviously, their brains are still developing, and executive functioning and consequences and risks are not things that in general they're fully equipped to think through. So, that's the concern. Figuring out what to do about it is really hard because so many kids are really interested in these forms of interactions. And I think we as parents, in a kind of worldwide way, kind of abdicated the first line of defense, which was to delay the introduction of phones and tablets and social media into kids' lives. I think it's gotten harder for families to do that even than when my kids were growing up. My kids are now 21 and 24. And I remember struggling with this and trying to postpone this kind of exposure, but then also feeling like because my kids didn't have iPhones and weren't on, at the time, I guess Facebook, now it would, and Instagram and Snapchat, maybe it's something else now, because they weren't on those sites, that they were like missing out. There's a lot of fear of missing out that drives the exposure that's become the norm. And honestly, I think this is a very hard problem for parents to tackle individually. For the reasons I was just saying, when you try to do something that takes your kid out of the social environment and structure, then that can be isolating and kids can really rebel. And then you can end up having to enforce rules that are not even worth enforcing and just sort of create a lot of friction between you and your child. So, I think that one promising route, and I wonder if people want to talk more about that in the comments time, is to try to have a whole group of parents or even a whole school or community decide that they're going to set limits. And, you know, in the last year or so, schools have started much more often to have kids put their phones in pouches when they get to school during the day. That's happening in New Haven, where I live, this year. I think there's been a kind of initial resistance, but then, as far as I can tell, often it kind of in time becomes accepted and even appreciated. And then I also think there are these questions about whether kids could be older when they first enter social media, whether there can be time limits on their participation to it, time limits on when they have their phones, and just a sense, I think, of that this is a really powerful technology. These kids are walking around with these major powerful computers in their pockets in a way that I think when we think of it as a phone, we forget that it does so many other things. And so just appreciating the significance of what they're being exposed to, I think, can help help parents figure out whether they really think this is a good idea and whether there's a kind of collective action they can take to try to put the brakes on.
Right, very good point. And I know some people have started suggesting that you could do a contract with your child if they, like, for example, if they have a need for class or some extracurricular, to be part of Snapchat with their group. And if they're not in that group, then they miss out on the scheduling or this or that kind of activity. So have you had any experience with the research that's being done or the effectiveness of having a contract with your child for specific uses of social media?
Yeah, I think there are some promising findings about that. And what I like about the idea of a contract is that it's two ways. It's not the same thing as imposing a rule or surveillance, which, you know, some teenagers are really going to struggle against. Not all the time. Sometimes kids don't mind when their kids are kind of looking over their shoulders or have, you know, various software on phones. But I think for other kids, that feels like an invasion of privacy. And a contract is something that both parties have to agree to. There has to be offer and acceptance. And so I think if you can sit down with your kid and have that kind of sense of mutual understanding, that can be really beneficial.
I know in your book you list and towards the end so many resources that people can refer to and utilize in their effort to deal with these very complicated issues. Are there some specific resource that you think would help in this particular area of the social media and to help the kids deal with it and see it as a way of communication, not as a way of, anonymously being rude or mean to their peers? Any specific resource you would cite?
Well, and for kids, I think kids really need to go to the people in their lives who they know, whether it's a trusted peer, someone that's slightly older, or it's a parent or a teacher. I'm kind of reluctant to go outside of that framework because they're kids. And as a parent, I wanted to know what my kids were doing. I think for parents, there are starting to be movements to delay exposure to phones, and that is like a way that you can figure out what has worked in other communities and whether there are tools that help persuade other families or help get kids on board. And there's one that's about delaying, it's wait until 8, it's called, and that's sort of a misleading name because they mean 8th grade, and I think maybe they even mean like the end of 8th grade, so it's sort of a strange name, but I've heard good things about that group from people in some cities.
And what about parents' use of phones themselves as role models for their children? And what's your advice or what does your research show in terms of how we can better cope with that and be a better role model?
I mean, there's just no question that kids see what their parents are doing and they either mirror it or they reject it or they notice hypocrisy. Like that's just how it goes. I think it's very hard. We all are addicted to our phones. They provide a lot of entertainment and engagement as well as cause trouble. And it is tough to set those limits, but if you can do it, you'll enrich your own life in terms of the quality of your personal interactions, especially at home. And it's such a dilemma to have an incredibly useful tool that is also a source of social problems. And that's where we're at with our devices. And so it can feel almost like unnatural to try to set limits oneself because we're so used to the quick hit of the phone. But recognizing how powerful they are, as I was saying earlier, I think is a really important step toward setting boundaries. And there's no question that if parents can't set limits, it's going to be really hard for them to ask kids and convince kids to do it.
Right. So that's something the parents have to work on. And in the community overall, I know school culture, peer relationships, as you said, family and parents, those all play a crucial role, obviously, in shaping the experiences of children. So going back to your main topic of bullying, what is your perspective on the collective responsibility of a community in addressing bullying?
I think one really important point to make is that the child or adult, but let's stick with kids, the kid who is experiencing bullying, the kid who is the victim in that moment, that child and that family has the most incentive to address the issue. It's also impossible for the victim of serious bullying to solve the problem by him or herself. Because bullying is about power, and it's about a power dynamic that involves everybody around the bully who is the person who's bullying, who is giving permission or being complicit in some way or just turning a blind eye or participating. And when you're a victim, it's because you're perceived as not having power, and you usually feel like you don't have power. And we don't ask the weakest party in a conflict to fix the problem by themselves. That's just not how it works. So I think the community has a couple of really important roles to play. One is creating a culture that rewards people, and especially kids, for kindness instead of for cruelty. That's like a mind shift that kids really can experience it. There are schools in which there is a really successful culture, and kids get a lot of social mileage out of helping other kids, out of looking out for each other, out of sticking up for someone who is perceived as different and vulnerable in some way. And then there are places where there isn't a lot of attention to those kinds of values, and then you see kids using cruelty and meanness as a form of power. And that's, a dynamic that I think most of us, people my age or a little younger or older, have experienced. We remember a more kind of, anything goes culture in high school and middle school in which there was a lot of suffering because of those power dynamics. So when you can create this culture, I think you can make a big difference for kids and in rates and prevalence of bullying. And then the second really important role is that when bullying is happening, to jump on it collectively, to try to prevent it, to offer sympathy. And that sounds obvious, but I think in fact it's often quite tricky. And one reason for that is that it can be really hard to distinguish bullying from a kind of run-of-the-mill social conflict in which it just seems like people are fighting with each other and you're not really sure who's right and you don't want to take sides. And it's just like hard to know exactly what's going on. But again, when there is clearly a weaker party and a sense that, especially if someone is experiencing being ganged up on, then the approbation of the community, the helping hand of the community becomes really important. And it's especially important and harder to model if the person who's being victimized doesn't have the most appealing personality, has really irritating parents, like irritating siblings. There can be all kinds of reasons why they don't seem like the most attractive subject of sympathy. That's pretty common. Bullies sometimes deliberately pick on kids who are less socially appealing. And you have to kind of, I think, confront in yourself your own biases and feelings about that and really try to think about what this underlying dynamic is and how, in the end, you want to be creating this better culture that will better serve everybody.
Interesting. So how can parents make themselves better aware and educate themselves about these issues and what the effects of bullying are on, especially on children and their mental health?
I think one thing is to be talking to your kid about what they're experiencing in school and trying to keep those lines of communication open, which I'm sure people on this call have thought about. Another is to be asking questions of teachers and other people in school about what's going on, and talking to other parents. And then a kind of another dimension of this is to have some kind of window into what kids are doing online. And I don't necessarily mean like all the time or something that seems to your child like spying, but having a sense of where are these accounts, what are they posting on them, what are other kids posting, what does your kid think about the posts that they're seeing? I mean, for some kids, I think especially girls, and the research bears this out, a lot of the visual photos and kind of posing that goes on sites like Instagram is actually like quite difficult for them and can make them feel really anxious, and a sense of, competitiveness and fear of losing out again. And I think those are tough emotions. And because your phone is in your pocket or right in front of you, it's not like broadcasting on the wall of the house or, publicly apparent on the bus what's happening. Parents have to be kind of alert to those things and making sure to check in on them so that's not all this kind of hidden current of anxiety that's washing over kids.
Got it. Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Um, so school-based anti-bullying policies, I think, were all the rage for a while, and then your stories in your book and some of the research is showing that there are lots of other ways of dealing with bullying incidents. So anyway, what steps do you think schools could take to strengthen communications with families on this issue and make the anti-bullying efforts not just school-based, for example? So how can the schools and the parents better communicate about this?
One thing I was struck by in my research was how useful positive reinforcement can be on a number of fronts. That changing the way kids get feedback in school and at home from like, no, you did that wrong to, hey, you did that right. That can really lighten the atmosphere in a way that I think then helps kids feel better about themselves and more prone as a result to be nice to each other. There also are programs that address social and emotional learning without necessarily having an explicit curriculum about bullying. And
Mhm.
it can be helpful, I think, to go at this problem indirectly. Sometimes when you talk to kids directly about bullying in a classroom, you kind of inevitably get them thinking about each other, right? You're almost like you could be outing the kids in the class who feel victimized in a way that can be uncomfortable. Whereas if you're doing a class on, social justice or meditation or other kinds of yoga, the kind of self-care, stress relief tactics that we are starting to see real research on, that can be a way of kind of alleviating stress and taking the edge off the school day that opens kids' minds to being kind to each other without necessarily hitting anti-bullying messages on the nose. Um, and a final thing is that kids respond to the messages they get about their peers. So, putting up posters in the school about how kids don't like bullying, really just don't approve of it,
Mhm.
that can also be helpful. And it's true. Like if you do surveys of kids, they will tell you that that's not an environment that they really want to be in. They don't want to be around kids who are enacting that behavior. And so that kind of classic nudge tactic of telling people what other people like or what other people want to be doing, can be really helpful. And I think finally, it's important to remember, and I hope I haven't lapsed into this too much tonight, that people who employ bullying tactics or people who are victimized, it's not their entire identity. It's like an act they're doing. It's not who they are. That kind of shift in your head from a verb, I'm sorry, from the noun to a verb, because then you can also remind people that it's possible to play different roles, and this isn't a kind of permanent mark, in either direction.
Mm. Interesting. And how about nurturing friendships among children? I know, as you said, some of the children who are targeted or whatever might be the ones who seem more socially awkward. What kind of things can the schools, the community, parents do to, help kids learn more social skills, friendship skills, and find friends in places where they might not expect to find them.
Yeah, I mean, one category I want to kind of unpack a little bit is the kids who are both bullies and victims.
Mm.
So, often kids who lash out are also experiencing being hurt themselves, a kind of classic phrase that, hurt people, hurt other people. And also they may be the kinds of kids who are having more trouble, and sometimes they express that by being mean to other kids, and sometimes they end up as the target, perhaps because they were mean, or just there's another way in which there's just like tension. It's funny, in our popular culture, we don't have a whole lot of models of this, even though it's a kind of classic type. And when I wrote my book, I was trying to think like what a good example was in movies or fiction. And one character I came up with is Snape, the teacher in the Harry Potter books. He is like, pretty bad for most of those books. He's definitely being mean. And then there's these flashbacks to Snape being like seriously bullied by James Potter, Harry's dad. And I think that's actually like a useful reminder, because one thing that's happening, I think, is showing that someone who experiences bullying as a kid can wind up kind of turning it on other people. Okay, so I just want to have Snape out there to think about for a second. So, I think when you are the parent of a kid who is not having a lot of social problems, it can be really worthwhile to try to get that kid to use their strength on behalf of someone else's weakness, and to just start thinking about, what it's like to have the tables turned, and also just to give them praise and affirmation if they do something that is sticking up for someone, because that can involve some kind of social risk for kids in small ways. But it's also a pretty amazing quality to develop in one's children. And so if you kind of keep a lookout for that and like preach about it a little bit, if you can do that without making your kid run in the opposite direction, I think that can be one way to really cultivate the better culture that we're talking about.
Right. And again, back to your point about rewarding them for that kind of behavior, first you would model it and then encourage it. And once you see them practicing it, it's so important to reward them for that.
Right, exactly.
Mhm.
And look, I mean, people have their preferences about the other humans they spend time with, right? Like it's normal to have closer as opposed to more distant relationships with the people in your community. And it's normal for parents to have closer and more distant ties. But if kids see that parents are being, respectful and civil with everybody else, and like trying to also be helpful to each other, that is a sign that parents can send.
Mhm. Very true. So the impact of words, I think, is something that is a theme throughout your book and your research. Do you want to elaborate on the title that you picked, Sticks and Stones, and the whole idea of words being harmful, if more so than physical actions, or as much as?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I did pick my title deliberately to go with the kind of children's nursery rhyme, and to kind of invert it, that sticks and stones actually can break at least your kind of mental bones or resources, and words can harm you too. And we have a different level of concern often about physical altercations and disputes, but when kids are experiencing a lot of words over time that make them feel terrible, that is a form of, emotional abuse or emotional trauma that they can go through. That's like important to take seriously rather than to kind of brush it off. And there's some gender differences here too. On average, boys are more likely to have to deal with conflict through relatively quick physical altercations. Not that much, because we don't really tolerate kids beating each other up on the playground anymore, but it still can be something that happens relatively quickly, whether it's verbal or physical. Girls tend to simmer more with each other, and sometimes with boys, but often with each other. And so being aware of those dynamics and how girls are experiencing them, like how they're navigating their friendships, dealing with girls who are creating a lot of tension and exclusion, especially. That's such a powerful, unfortunately, weapon that girls sometimes use against each other. I think those are important things to be aware of as you're trying to cultivate the kinder, more friendship-based relationships that kids are having.
And are there ways that communities can promote that as on a level that people can get involved, or volunteering, or, different kinds of organizations out there that are helpful for those aspects?
I mean, I really think any civic organization that has like a common project that people genuinely enjoy getting together, like those all are the building blocks of communities. It can be something that involves religious affiliation. It can be something based on, doing good for other members of the community or a cause outside the community that people are coming together for. It can be about sports or theater. There are all kinds of opportunities for that. And, what you really want is that people are coming together and they're thinking about something outside themselves. Another kind of strategy I have seen schools deploy effectively that interests me is relationships across age. We tend to be pretty segmented now in the range of ages that kids really spend time with. Sometimes older kids have a tremendous amount of wisdom to share about the school environment that they're in. And so, in high school, you can have a program where the seniors are in some managed way mentoring the ninth graders, or the eighth graders welcoming the sixth graders to middle school. I think if you set that up in a way that is like careful and responsible, and you make sure that kids have the maturity to be able to handle the role, those kinds of cross-age relationships can be a way of passing along a good kind of culture and wisdom from older kids to younger kids.
Yeah, we do have quite a bit of that happening here in the Scarsdale schools. I know they have the peer mentoring and whatnot in the high school. So I think the message is coming through there, and the kids seem to really, really enjoy it, being,
That's great.
Treated as equals or mentors and mentees on the various grade levels, I think has been really effective. Let's see what else. Oh, what would you like to talk a little bit about what other projects you have in the works?
Sure. I am not really right now working on a project that involves kids. I've been I came to the New York Times Magazine full time about 10 years ago. And I've more and more been pulled into doing coverage about the Supreme Court or major legal issues. And about politics. I think that the kind of question of bullying in our American political life has kind of loomed, and I've thought about that. But, I think there's another way to think about our dynamics, which is more about, what the rules are and how much we have faith in those rules and where they come from, and then how they play out in different policy domains. So I was writing a lot over the summer about the Justice Department and what kinds of changes might occur depending on who wins the presidential election. And I've also covered the turn toward a more conservative Supreme Court. And right now, I'm looking forward after the election. In January, I'm going to go on leave to work on a book that's about the history of reproductive rights, actually starting in the 19th century. So in some ways, I've kind of moved into more reporting about adults, not because I've lost interest in children, just because I tend to, my second book after Sticks and Stones is actually about the criminal justice system, and I have found that I want each book to be like its own project, just as a way of keeping myself interested. If also it's a little nervous making, because then I have to start all over again and learn about something new.
Well, of course, you had to bring up the topic of the political climate, and we see, I don't know, some people would say there's a lot of bullying going on in the political climate, and that must have a huge influence on children who see that, and also their parents who see that, and talking about it around the dinner table. What sort of takeaways would you have for people on, how to cope with that, and digest that through the proper lens and focus so that you send the right message to your family members.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, kids growing up today are growing up in this environment that has much more kind of like the wheels are coming off feeling about it in terms of the kinds of self-expression that are part of the political world. Just the way people talk about each other and to each other is much more kind of free, for better and for worse, I think. And I think kids can find that pretty confusing. They're being taught like one set of rules about how to behave, and then they're seeing people on the national stage break all of those rules. Um, and it can be unsettling. And I think in some ways, the more common it becomes, the harder it is to say, well, that's just like one particular politician, and that's not the norm. I think when kids have questions about how people are acting, it's like better to just be forthright about what you approve of or disapprove of instead of trying to pretend that it's not happening. And I also think that it's to some degree, it's kids can benefit from being shielded from like the most angry part of our politics. It just can be a lot to take in. I think sometimes we forget that the whole idea of something being age appropriate is still a really important value in American culture, even if we may disagree about what the things are we should put off. If you have a sense of that as a parent, it's okay to try to have some authority about that, I think.
Interesting. Do you have some other perspectives in terms of like support systems that we can use? School counselors, I guess, is one aspect that I thought was very interesting, brought up in your book in various places. We've already spoken about teachers and the anti-bullying programs, but how about let's talk about school counselors a little bit. Do most schools have them? And if so, are they effective? And if not, how could they be more effective?
I think school counselors can play a really important role because they often are trained to be sensitive to the kinds of concerns, social concerns that we're talking about. And they hopefully are clued in enough about the dynamics of the school or a classroom to be able to have a sense of what's happening. The hard part is that they also, depending on the school system, may have many, many children they're responsible for. And I think they often can end up spending a lot of their time on a few different situations that are causing, that are just like have more need or are causing more an issue for other administrators. And that may not be so bad. It may be that channeling their energy in a certain direction really helps the school be on a strong footing and remain a peaceful place. And I think it's like a matter of having enough resources in place. And I would hope that in a community like Scarsdale, that's something that is a priority and that people see the value of. I think another lesson of the value of school counselors is that sometimes kids really benefit from relationships with trusted adults who are not their parents or not related to them. That it can be easier to get certain messages from people who you don't live with and aren't fully responsible for, and you don't have all the complications of a family relationship. And so coaches sometimes can play that role, or the parents of other friends can be valued adults. And I think opening the doors to those kinds of opportunities for your kids or playing that role in someone else's life can be very valuable in a community.
Right. So that would be, for example, finding a way to welcome, to create a welcoming atmosphere in your family or in your community in general for people who are, different or marginalized, both adults and children, right?
Yep. Yeah. I think that's absolutely something that we all can kind of look for opportunities for. This is a good time of year to be talking about all of this because Halloween opens up a lot of interactions that just like don't normally happen. Kids go out and they walk around at night, and at least in my neighborhood, there tend to be a lot of parents out and about too, or sitting on their stoops, and that can be a chance to meet people you don't know, praise other people's kids, no matter like what their costume is, just a kind of sense of like warmth and social acceptance in the zaniness of the holiday, which can be just a nice thing that neighborhoods can come together around.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's time now we can take some questions from the chat and the audience. Oh, and Jay has proposed a question, or he's forwarded one. Could you speak? Sorry. Could you speak to the point in your book about aggression as a form of social capital among adults and children, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what's very interesting to me when I was doing this research, aggression is a human quality that has served its purpose for, our entire evolution. Like if people didn't have some aggression, they wouldn't have drive, they wouldn't have motivation, they wouldn't have figured out how to be like hunters and gatherers and survive all those many millennia ago. And so I feel like it's important to think about the necessity of aggression in some circumstances as well as the downsides of it. And this can be, I think, especially a challenge for women and girls who often are trained or socially conditioned to think like we shouldn't be aggressive. But there are certain instances like speaking up in class or in an audience or in a sports situation where aggression again has its benefits. The problem is that when aggression is unmediated, or it comes out a kind of in an oppositional way against other people, then it becomes this social force that can lead people to be mean to each other. And so these distinctions, in a kind of sense, starting obviously, one hopes with self-regulation, but then also seeing the opportunities that exist for the kind of healthy forms of aggression that we want people to develop, but then trying to also make sure that they stay in those particular channels. That can be very important. Sometimes you can see with a sports team, whether it's children or adults, that on the field, people are being intense and competitive, and that's aggressive, but that's also the right forum. But then sometimes it doesn't stay on the field, right? You see people get into other scraps outside of the game or just talking trash about each other, undermining teammates or the other team. And it's challenging. We don't turn, our emotions don't have the kind of on and off switch that ideally, or that would be more easily lead to ideal behavior.
We have a question here also from the participants regarding how much parents can influence their kids in being kind to others. What do you think is more important for parents to do? Directed discussions or modeling their own behavior? We discussed each of those. Which one do you feel is more effective?
I think in the end that modeling is it's the harder thing to do. And it's also the more constant one. It's the regular message that you send to your kids. So, and if kids see you do one thing and say another thing, they're going to notice that. So if I had to choose one, I think I would choose the modeling. Luckily, of course, we don't have to do just one, but certainly as a kind of regular occurrence, I think the modeling is really important. And then if that's happening, there might be a need for fewer discussions, perhaps.
Understood. And we have a couple more minutes left. May I pose another question from the participants? One question is, have you learned through your research about any countries, societies, or communities specifically that have much less bullying? And if so, what can we learn from them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a kind of depressing answer, I guess, a little bit, which is some of the powerful anti-bullying movements started in places like Scandinavia or the Netherlands. And I think those countries have lots of differences from the United States. They tend to have stronger social safety nets and a kind of general commitment to social welfare that we are more divided about. The reason I find that slightly depressing is they're also countries with a lot of homogeneity in terms of things like race and ethnicity. Less so right now, but historically, which is when I think these kind of movements first took root. And I mention that just because I think one of the big challenges in the United States right now is all of our difference and figuring out how to feel strong senses of human connection and solidarity across the differences that tend to divide us politically. Class is another important social difference, and that is one that obviously every country has people of different income levels and class backgrounds. And so one way to think about the examples from places like the Netherlands or Sweden or Denmark is that they are able to make people feel a sense that they could be any class, that there's enough sense of mobility and also just general responsibility for welfare, that those differences should be surmounted, as opposed to becoming excuses for people to stay apart from each other and not take care of each other.
Very good, very good. Jay, do we have any other questions from the participants, or Millie, do you know where we stand with that now?
Here, let me just pull this up. I have a few here. Oh no, you mentioned the presidential campaign and how to turn the conversation, or how to have a conversation around how to use the presidential campaign into a positive against bullying, like a positive discussion against bullying.
Yeah, any more to elaborate on that, Emily?
This is a little bit tricky because I'm a newspaper reporter and I don't want to take partisan positions, and I'm sure the library doesn't want me to do that either. There is a way in which, as a candidate, former President Trump poses particular challenges because of the way he talks and the way he, treats other people. And I think, again, both limiting kids' exposure to everything, the most extreme versions of it, which I think we saw some in the rally at Madison Square Garden earlier in the week, but then also answering their questions, stating one's own values in the face of conduct that may not be something you would want to see from your home or that you wouldn't do yourself, making those distinctions. One thing about former President Trump is that people sometimes find him very funny. He's really good at being an entertainer. And so there's something kind of seductive about that, I think, especially for kids who are drawn to rebellion. And it's important to have kids think through what exactly they think is funny, at whose expense, and what are all the parts of this person that come with that as well.
I think it must be difficult also for like a parent trying to explain to their child when there's this background noise of, the tension and the animosity or aggression even in the political field, for the parents to not also, again, back to the modeling thing, where the parents have to be careful, I think, to not overblow their own reaction to what's being said in the political arena.
Yes,
right?
I think that's true. Sometimes we can be we can get kind of obsessive about what's happening and be too caught up in it and kind of amplify it, even in our distress about it.
Right,
yes,
the kids
kids
see that, and
definitely see that.
They figure that that's the way you respond to this kind of behavior, is you lose your own cool. So I think it's important for all of us to sort of, figure that.
Modulate.
Yes, modulate
Yes.
it. Exactly.
Yes.
Emily, can you provide an example of when a parent should get involved in a bullying situation and when they allow a child or teen to navigate it on their own?
Yeah, sure. One of the kids I wrote about in my book was a child in upstate New York who was being bullied because, he was presenting as queer and he was interested in musicians who were queer, and he was like painting his nails and just doing things that in that community at that moment were outside of the norms. And his parents, I think, were not that checked into what was happening with him and were counting on him to kind of deal with this themselves. But then at some point, he actually got pushed down the stairs at school. And that's a serious event. And I think that is the kind of thing that clearly, as a parent, I would want to know what the school was doing and what was happening and try to help talk the kid through solving the problem. It doesn't mean that you're going to show up on the front steps of the school and take the kids who are doing this to your child in hand yourself. But it does mean that you want to be on what's happening whenever there's any kind of physical risk to a kid. And I think also when you see signs in your child of anxiety or depression, asking questions and trying to understand what they're going through in the time that they're apart from you that might account for that is also like something that's worth doing. Sometimes, of course, kids don't want to tell you about what's happening. And that was always the hardest thing for me as a parent when I realized there had been this important issue that was weighing on my child and I didn't really know about it in the moment. And that's when it's important to just try to have the kind of relationship with your kid where they will come to you when there's something really wrong. And that's something you have to build in all kinds of small ways all the time. You're not going to be able to just like activate it necessarily at the right moment. And in terms of what kids should navigate on their own, if it's conflict, then conflict is something we all have to learn how to deal with in life. So sometimes you hear kids like talking in a way to each other that doesn't feel like it's necessarily exactly what you want. Maybe their voices are raised or they're being mean in some way. But if it seems like the power dynamic is pretty level and kids are, giving it as well as taking it, making some room for that and letting them figure out how to have those kinds of interactions without necessarily jumping into the middle of it, I think is important. I mean, I'm definitely someone who is sympathetic to the notion that kids are not having as much kind of free range as they used to, and that the number of activities they do that are spontaneous with other kids where there isn't a lot of supervision or a lot of organization, that we've kind of let that go as part of just regular American life, and that kids actually learned a lot from those interactions. Sometimes learned to be bored, sometimes learned how to defend themselves.
Do you think that the greater societal acceptance of LGBTQ plus issues, mixed race relationships, body positivity, and other signs of societal progress is leading or would lead to less bullying, or will kids always look for something to pick on?
That's such a good question. I mean, I think those are all really important and positive developments because they take off the table these immutable attributes, right? This idea that there are just like certain things that are inherent to who you are, but that are somehow like bad and foreign and othering. And so in that sense, I think that they are a means of that the acceptance, wider acceptance is a means of reducing bullying. The extent that kids are following in those grooves when they build friendships or choose to exclude based on all of those kinds of lines that can seem like they have significance, but in fact just like obscure people's common humanity. At the same time, it is true that kids, like you can have a whole bunch of pretty similar kids, and there will be some of them who get left out some of the time, even if they all kind of check a bunch of boxes that go across these boundaries of the categories you were talking about. So, and look, I think one thing that is worth saying is like, bullying is not a problem that ever like entirely goes away, right? It's like many things, you want to minimize it without imagining that you're going to be able to like wipe it out altogether. But the less we have of it, the less that kind of suffering there is. And so it's worth it to try to have this kind of harm reduction approach to it, as opposed to imagine that you're going to stamp it out completely.
So you mentioned earlier about dealing with, when children are in conflict with one another, it's one child's story versus the other, and it's difficult to know like who to believe and stuff like that. How should a parent navigate that situation when, let's say their child is a target of bullying and now it's their word against the bullies, and there's kind of like a stalemate of like who to believe or what to believe. Like how should a parent handle that situation?
I think one thing is like you have to have a moment of kind of adult thinking where your own cool-headedness prevails. You may entirely believe your own child, but you have to realize that other people may not. Not because your kid isn't telling the truth, but because there isn't a form of objective evidence you could present about what's happening. And sometimes it's just honestly not even worth trying to navigate or like prove exactly what's happened, because you can just spend a lot of time on the sort of act of persuasion in a way that is like very, if you think something is true and other people don't believe you, or especially don't believe your child, that can be very upsetting. But it may be that the reason you're not being believed is out of your hands effectively. Social media, of course, sometimes changes this because kids leave a record behind. If they haven't deleted messages, you're not on an app like Snapchat where things go away automatically by themselves. So, sometimes it's useful to actually be able to have like receipts, right? Evidence about what has happened. But other times, what you're really trying to address is a larger dynamic. And you have to figure out a way to help your child realize what they can and can't prove and convince other people of, that doesn't make them feel like if they don't win in this particular kind of litigating essentially their claims, that that isn't a reflection on their value or on their persuasiveness personally. It's also about this larger set of facts.
Should parents of a victim try to speak with the parent of a bully?
Yeah, that's a question I get asked a lot. And I think that the answer is often not and occasionally yes. If you don't know the parents of another child, and you don't really know anything about the dynamic in the family, even the most like good faith effort to talk to someone else can really backfire on your kid, on you, in a way that can be difficult. On the other hand, if you have reason to think that an overture might be accepted and there's a way to kind of make common cause or explain and help your kid by enlisting this other parent, then I think those kinds of private negotiations can be really helpful. Sometimes I think schools get put in a position where they're being asked to solve a lot of problems that are actually developing outside of school as much as inside, especially if they're happening on social media. And so if parents can figure out how to help kids solve problems absent the structure of school oversight, that could be just like a help to everybody. But it's something that you have to approach carefully, because you just have to have a sense of whether the conversation is likely to go well or not. And you mostly just don't want to create something where you've gotten someone's back up and then that's going to bring down more trouble for your kid.
So that's all the questions that I have. Oh, actually, there's one more. Why do you think children who have been bullied, excluded, or bully others? Or why do you think children who have been bullied exclude or bully others? Is this a form of self-protection?
It can be. I think also it's that people who have experienced unhappiness often become unhappy and then they do bad things to other people because they think it's going to make them feel better, and it's a means of power, even though it doesn't really work. We all have our moments like that, right? Where you've experienced something and it's bad, but then you kind of inflict it on someone else. It's like the opposite of a virtuous cycle. And I think often the more people experience adversity or trauma and they're not getting support for it, or they're not having a way of really like processing it successfully, then that can lead them to lash out at other people.
So now I think that's all the questions that we have. So thank you so much, Emily, for your time, and Val, thank you so much for asking the questions that are probably on a lot of parents' mind. I hope everybody felt that this conversation was helpful and gave them some clarity, and look for the book if you don't already have it, right? Like it's in the Scarsdale Library. I think there's also a virtual book option. I don't know off the top of my head. Maybe Jay, you might know that. Different ways to get the book. If you're there, I don't know if you're there.
They have the book is available in the Bronx River Books in downtown Scarsdale. Right. And I think also, Jay, I don't know if you want to jump in on this, but the parent support groups, would you like to speak to that topic for the audience members who might?
I would. Thank you, Val. And again, thank you, Emily and Val, for being with us and sharing your insights on the topic. Bullying is a big topic. It's probably not something that we're going to get all the answers in one evening, even with incredible experts as yourselves, so that we might encourage the audience members who are in parent support groups to please continue this conversation. The book does have in the back some suggested questions for discussion that I think groups can certainly build off of. But certainly we wanted this event to be really a kickoff of an ongoing conversation and really not just a one and done event. So, please bring these conversations to your parent support groups and can keep the conversations going.
Thank you. Personally, thanks for inviting me to participate. And Emily, it was a pleasure to meet you and really fascinating to read the book and learned a lot from it. So thank you.
Thank
And
you
Millie,
all so much. It really is a pleasure. Thanks for the great questions, Val, and also for the great questions from the audience. I haven't thought about this all for a little while because my book is from a few years ago, and it's really fun to dive back into it.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.